Well, we are that much closer to Christmas. Are you excited? That is lame. If I asked that in a room full of children, they'd be like, yes, we're so excited. That's right, they're not spending the money. They haven't been disappointed yet. Yeah, I understand. Hey, it is good to see you this morning, and glad that you are here. A couple of things to let you know about that are coming up. One, of course, next week we're having an open house. You can see that. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but if you want to come by and check out our place and see us and see your friends and eat some good snacks, come on out. We'd love to see you. But there, obviously, the service is coming up, as Mark already talked about, but there's a couple things that are happening. One is that we are updating our directory. We do this every year. We want to update the directory, make sure that we're keeping up, because nowadays phone numbers, emails change rather frequently. There's a couple different ways to do this, because as we update the directory, we will have printed copies, but we're trying to move things towards the app. And so the directory is actually going to be available electronically. You have it on your phone. And so you can do it two ways. If you're a non-tech person, there will be papers where you can just fill out and update your information. And if not, you actually should have all received this week an email, right, with a link in there that you can update your information, and you can let us know if we can put it online. If you're under 18, we will not put it online. It's only for people 18 and older. But we want to put that in the app, so make sure you do that update by the end of the year if you can. Sooner would be better. Last thing is April the 9th. Now you're thinking, that is a long ways away, right? That's all the way into April of next year, but that is the Saturday of Palm Sunday weekend. We want to take a bus as a church to see David at Sight and Sound in Lancaster. So we need you to sign up if you're interested. There are only 56 seats. If you're number 58, you have to drive your own car, okay? So there's only so many. So we would love to have everybody sign up. We have to do some booking on that probably by the end of the year just to hold our spot. And we're going to do it where we can meet here in the morning, take the bus up, see like a 3 o'clock show, have dinner, come back. The price, you can see it's in the sign-up sheet. I think it's $115. That includes the bus and the ticket. Dinner would be extra. And if you have children coming that are under the age of 12, it's like half of that. All right? It's going to be a great time, but we need you to be thinking about that now, even though that's a long ways away. Good? All right. Scott, why don't you come on up? We're going to do something we hopefully will do more frequently in the days ahead, in the months ahead. I'd call it an elder update. We want to make sure that as leaders you kind of know some of the things that are going on in the church, some of the things that happen maybe behind the scenes that you aren't aware of. And so Scott, who is our
departing elder.
I was going to say our senior elder, and then I realized that wasn't going to sound really good. But Scott has been an elder currently on our board longer than anybody else. We have term limits. You can't just be an elder forever. 6 years is the limit. And so he's finishing up his 6th year at the end of January this year, and so he's going to be stepping off. So I thought it might be good just to share briefly, what do we do with that? When someone steps off, how do we replace? What's going on?
What's really nice about it now, with our new pastor, has introduced some good processes that we can follow, and I am excited about it because it really lays out for us for the future tense of how we will be looking at future men in the future for position for eldership. And we have a nice system that's now being incorporated. Actually, presently right now, Scott Smith has gone through that process. We're taking him through that. It will involve both the nominating committee and the elders to work together on this process. But what's really exciting to me is not only currently to, say, fill a current position that needs to be filled by an elder, but also we'll be having a process that will be beginning to groom young men for future eldership 2-3 years down the road. And that's part of this process. That is what excites me, that we'll be working actively and proactively on.
Sure, and that's not just restricted, obviously, to eldership. It kind of starts there, because we're starting at the top, but we want to build this idea of leadership development for men, for women, for young, for old, right? To have them and be invested in, which is awesome. And you'll hear more about that as time goes on. So what is one of the, as we kind of go through all this and we set our direction as a church, what's the key dates that you want to tell them about that they need to be engaged with us in terms of the annual?
Yeah, I don't know the date.
Last Saturday. I don't know the date either.
Okay, well, yeah, whatever. Yeah, yeah. It's the last Saturday of January.
Last Sunday. Sorry.
Yeah. What's once again, I think we're kind of actually trying to re-envision, because we used to call it our annual meeting, and it kind of typically is a little dry bones, but I believe that now we're trying to look at it more in a very positive way, a celebratory way, and looking at our future. Not celebrate what the Lord has done for us in the past year, but also look at what the Lord is going to do us. Have expectations, have an expectancy, and be believing what God's going to do for us in the coming new year.
Yeah, I mean, I've been here for a year, and so now it's like God has said, okay, you've learned some stuff, and you've kind of seen what the church is about. Where are we going next? And how are we investing in the next thing? And that's one of the places where we talk about that and then introduce that to the church. So, 29th, there you go, January
29th.
So, and actually part of that, I'm going away this week, actually, to kind of think about some of that.
Yeah, I kind of, when Weldon shared this initially, what he does, he goes away for 3 days. It's a personal retreat he takes in the preparatory for the coming new year. And I thought on that when I heard him share that with me the first time, and I thought back, I don't remember any pastor that I have served with throughout my life that did that. And it just, not in an impressed way, but a real, I just thought it was really cool that he takes that time, takes that consideration, shuts himself away. And so what I am saying to you today is I admonish you that he will be gone Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. And I implore you to be praying those whole 3 days for our pastor as he seeks the face of God, to know what the Lord wants for ARAC Church for this coming year. And just that he would just, really convey to Weldon, what's on God's heart to give to Weldon. And so I encourage you to be praying for that. I am definitely committing myself for 3 days of prayer.
Well, I appreciate that, because it sounds very noble until you've been sitting by yourself in a room for 3 hours. And then you think, oh, I got to do this. I got to do this for 2 more days. So yes, please pray. So one of the last things that I wanted Scott to share was, as you're stepping off, is there anything that's kind of that God has put on your mind, impressed on your heart, as you are stepping into the next season for yourself, either about our church or about the direction even for yourself personally?
As I look back, one of the most significant things I think I see for my time being with here is that we are entering into a new season with leadership. In some ways, my departing will represent the previous generation. And now we have the next generation that is going to lead us. And that should be exciting to us, that we've been able to hand that over to our next generation of leaders to take us into the future. And so you need to be praying for those young men, younger than us. They're not overly young, but younger than us. But that you be lifting them up before the Lord, and that the Lord will use them. That is extremely exciting to me as one who's stepping away, knowing I can look back and see that we have really turned a page in some ways in our growth with our leadership, and now the next generation is here.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you sharing. Any one of these guys, I always urge you, if you ever have any questions or there's things you don't understand or don't know, ask. They'll answer, and they'll tell you what's going on. If they don't know the answer, they'll find it for you. Well, hey, we're in the last week. We're concluding our series on authority, submission, and trusting God's plan. We're finishing that today. Next week, we have a very special service that I highly encourage you to be at. But we're going to close this series out today, and if you've been with us through this time, you know that the theme, what we've kind of been talking about through this entire series, has been this idea of inner transformation, right? Wanting to be different people, that God is interested in growing us in the inner man, and that in the inner woman, and that our leadership, our effectiveness, our growth are all, just in terms of the external, are all secondary to and dependent on this internal, inner transformation. And what we've learned over the past 5 weeks, that's a slow process. It doesn't happen easily. We tend to let it get derailed a little bit by our fear and our worry sometimes, and discouragement. But God is actually trying to walk us through this school of brokenness, of being submitted to Him in order to be transformed in our inner person. And so we've done this through looking at the first 3 kings of Israel. And so if you kind of think back, we've had this whole idea of Israeli intertransformation. We've had two different kings we've looked at so far. First of all, you have Saul, right, who was so fearful and so insecure that he tried so desperately to hold on to his kingship. He didn't want to let it go, and it led him to this erratic behavior, unfulfilling life. Eventually, it cost him everything. But then we've also looked at David, who allowed God to break him repeatedly. And even though he was fighting discouragement and he had to deal with things, and even though God had promised him the kingship, he had to kind of push through, even respecting authority when it didn't deserve it. By the way, which of these two kings do you identify with the most? You don't have to say it out loud. I'm curious. But if you're like me, you probably identify a little bit with both, don't you? A little bit on the left, maybe more on the left than the right, depending on who you are. Well, today, I want to look at one more king. And I think this king illustrates something that can sabotage our inner transformation. And what makes this one so tricky, because it leaves us stuck. It actually leaves it where we can't move forward. But it's one of those things that's really difficult to see in us and very easy to see in others. And what I want to do this morning is unpack that a little bit. So before we do, let me pray for us, that the Spirit would be here. Lord, I'm always excited that your Spirit is speaking and that you are intent on not just teaching us information, but as we've learned in this series, you want to transform us. You want our hearts to be different. You want the way we think and the decisions we make and how we use our time and our energy and how we deal with people. You want to continually transform that to be more like you. And so that's our prayer, is that the things that we see and learn would not stop in our heads, but that they would move into our hearts and into our mind and into our being, that we might be different. And so I pray that you would, in one small way this morning, help us take a step down that path. And so it's in your name I pray. Amen. So what is this thing that's going to potentially derail us? And here's what it is. A rebellious spirit. That's the problem. I mean, none of you struggle with this, okay? I understand that, okay? None of you have a problem with this, but I thought we should talk about it because you all know people who struggle with this, okay? So the fact that we can talk about it means you can help everybody around you that has this problem, even though we as a church have no issue. But when you think of rebellion, what do you think of? The dictionary definition is this. Rebellion is the action or process of resisting authority, control, or convention. But what picture does that bring up in your mind? Like when you think of rebellion, what goes through your mind? A coup, right? You see this on the TV, some type of military kind of action. Maybe a protest, a strike, a walkout, something where they're rising up against their oppressors. But what does it look like at an individual level? And is it always wrong? Our country exists because the colonies rebelled against the king. Rebellion is sometimes lauded as a way to depose or get rid of horrible leaders. People who rebel against injustice are lifted up as heroes or trailblazers. But if you've ever had children, and you say, I want you to do something, and they do this, and they do nothing, you're not like, love your rebellious attitude, right? That never works. We don't want to see it in our children. You watch it, and I love having grandkids because it takes me back, because you see them ask, and you can watch them think, should I do this, or should I not do this? What are the consequences? And you can just picture and processing whether they want to be rebellious. We don't want that. And if you've ever led anything, it doesn't matter if it's a company, an organization, a ministry, whatever it is, and you have rebellious people in it, you hate it because they make your life miserable. So what is it? Is it good? Is it bad? What does it look like? And to make it all more confusing, do you remember what God said? We looked at this earlier. When he rejected Saul, do you remember what he said? For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry, and because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you as king. So rebellion is a big deal to God. So how do we identify it? What do we do about it? Well, that's why we're looking at Absalom. So we're going to take a look at this story. Now the account of Absalom comes after David had ruled for many, many years. So he had come, he went through all the things we talked about. He became king. He had ruled for decades. He had done largely well by the country, like for the people, even though his own personal journey was kind of rocky, didn't always do so well. He had multiple wives, not the least of which was Bathsheba, who he, killed Uriah to, you read that whole story, to have her. He had multiple children through multiple wives. And by all accounts, he really wasn't the best dad that you've ever seen. And in fact, in one of those, you can't make this stuff up stories, his oldest son, Amnon, who was the heir to the throne, fell in love with his stepsister, right? Same father, different mother. And he got so infatuated with her, and he didn't know what to do. He was just overwhelmed by it. He ends up arranging this whole thing. He ends up raping his stepsister, really just destroys her life. She's wrecked. Absalom, who's the third born, so he's the third oldest, but he's also Tamar, the girl his older brother raped. It's his sister. Begins to scheme and plot. And for 2 years he waits, and then finally he sets it up, and he ends up murdering his older brother. But of course, this sets him on the run, because he's like, well, I just killed my brother. He was the heir to the throne, so he runs away. David and him have no contact for years. In fact, he's kind of exiled. And if you read the story, and it's a long story, but it's a really, really good one. If you read the story, even when he comes back, David doesn't see him. They manipulate things. They finally get together. There's this apparent reconciliation, but it's actually really shallow. Nothing ever happens. And all of this sets the backdrop for the story of Absalom. Now, who was Absalom? Maybe you've read this before. In all of Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his feet, there was no blemish in him. Ladies, if you ever want to write a card to your husband, just quote that verse and stick their husband's name in there, and he'll be good, okay? Whenever he cut the hair on his head, obviously this was a big deal to him, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. And I know there's some of you out there going, man, I wish my hair would grow that fast. Okay? He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. So all this to say, this was the kind of man that all the other nobles wanted to set their daughter up with. This was the guy. I mean, he was rich, he was good looking, he was the son of the king, he was flawless. And as time went on, Absalom used this to his advantage because he wasn't just good looking, he was clever. And here's what happens. It's all in 2 Samuel. There's a whole bunch of chapters this runs through. We're going to start here in chapter 15. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. Now, let's pause here. This has nothing to do with transportation. This has nothing to do with this. He wasn't trying to go somewhere fast. He wanted to do something impressive. And there's nothing more impressive than having a man run ahead of you with chariots following as you come, because when you show up, everybody knows. And you're like, we know who that is. This guy has influence. He's got power. He had this image he wanted to project. And so he did. And he would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. He was ambitious. He's hardworking, actually, because he's getting up early. He's going out, and this is significant because it says he goes out to the side of the road leading to the gate. In other words, he says, I'm going to get out in front of this. I'm not going to sit by the gate. I'm actually going to go outside the city because I can interact with people long before they ever get where the official people are. I'm going to actually go out and I'm going to see the people. When anyone came with a complaint, he placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, what town are you from? He would answer, well, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Then Absalom would say to him, look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you. And Absalom would add, if only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case can come to me. I would see that they have received justice. And also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand and take a hold of him and kiss him. Now, again, pause the story. You have to picture what's going on here. So people are coming because they did this. The king was not just the ruler politically. In this culture, the king was also the seat of judgment. They were the seat of wisdom. And so when people needed things solved, they came to the king, right? If they had arguments or they had issues or they had things, they would come to the king. So Absalom's out there going, where are you from? Very congenial. And they would tell him, like, what's your complaint? And they would tell him, he's like, oh man, I totally understand them. If I was in your place, I had the same complaint. In fact, this should probably get solved, but I don't see any other representatives of the king here. I really feel bad for you. I mean, if I was king, this wouldn't happen. I mean, I would definitely make sure that you were taken care of. And then look at the last line where it says, he would reach out his hand and take a hold of him and kiss him. So you got to picture this because, of course, they know Absalom's the son of the king. And so they come in. The first thing they're doing is they're bowing. And Absalom's like, no, stand up. And he would give him a hug and say, no, I'm like you. We're the same. He presented quite an image, albeit a very false one. And in the process of doing this, because he did this for years, he became more popular than David. Absalom behaved this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And this goes on. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, so there's this kind of this, you don't see this, but the story is basically saying, hey, look, there's a big chunk of time here where this behavior is repeated over and over and over and over. And Absalom finally gets enough steam where enough people are whispering in his ear saying, you know, Absalom, I wonder, maybe you should be king. I can see Absalom going, oh, I never thought of that before. All right? So at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron, which was a significant place where they crowned kings. But he says, I want to go fulfill a vow I made to the Lord while your servant was living at Geshur and Aram. This is when he was in exile. And you can read that previously in the story. I made this vow that if the Lord brings me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. To which David just said, man, it took you 4 years to get here? Okay. The king said, go in peace. David said, all right, go. So he went to Hebron. But then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. And then get this, because he wants it to all be above board, 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about what is going on. In other words, he picked 200 people, good standing, people who would show up, had no clue about anything that was happening under the surface, but they would give an air of legitimacy to everything that was going to happen. And while Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilead and his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept increasing. He gets acclaimed king, and the first thing that happened is someone runs to David and says, here's what's going on. And David says, we got to run. We need to get out of the city. And so David abandons the capital city, and Absalom rode in as the new king of Israel. And the rebellion is in full swing, and David is on the run again. Now, we're going to look a little further in the story, but we've got to pause here for a little bit. Because the heart of Absalom is on full display here. This is not the case, and it's so different from David's. This is not the case of Absalom saying, oh, I just want to do right by the people. And after enough people said, oh, shucks, I guess I should be king. No. There was a manipulation, a rebelliousness that started long before that. And you got to picture, compare Absalom to where David was 30 years earlier. A young man who doesn't like the king, who would like the throne, doesn't like the king ahead of him, and yet his response is as different from David's as you could possibly imagine. Absalom is a picture of what happens when you act out in rebellion. Now, how many of you at some point in your life have said, you can't tell me what to do? Right? They can't tell me what to do. Nobody's ever said that? See, when we talk about a rebellious spirit this morning, it's less about the actions and more about what's motivating the actions. That inner voice that doesn't like the idea of submitting to another person, unless their ideas match ours or they're doing the things we would have done anyway. Which case, by the way, that's not submitting. And if they're an acceptable leader and they match up to all the criteria I've put in my head, then I'm in. But if they don't, I don't want to. So let's take this, and we'll put it all together here, and let me give you this definition for a rebellious spirit, or rebellion. Rebellion is reserving for myself the right to make the final decision. I don't know about you, but that is uncomfortable, and you may or may not even agree with it. Because isn't that the American way? I get to decide. No one gets to tell me what to do. I will take all your valued input, and then I will decide. I get to decide. You don't get to decide for me. That's how we think. But I would submit to you that rebellion starts right there. And it was illustrated really interesting to me this week. So I was looking for a book, and I put it on my Amazon list. I might want to read it in the future. So I thought I was going through it, and I was going to order it. And I said, well, let me read the reviews on this book. And it was from an author that I've read in the past. I really like their stuff. I think they're fairly solid. But the first review that pops up, 1 star. It starts out saying, if I could give negative stars to this book, I would. And he goes on to just rip this book. But then what was really interesting to me was his last statement in his review was, if your pastor recommends this book, leave your church and run as far as you can and go to a different church. Woo! And I thought, that is a rebellious spirit right there. I get to choose. I get to be the arbiter of what's right. The rebellious spirit is when I figure that the right to decide where I go and what I do ultimately resides with me. And there's two components to this, and you see them in the whole story of Absalom. The first is this: that means I get to decide what's best. So I'm the one who decides. And this, by the way, this flows from the assumption that you know what's best, which you all do, of course, right? You're very smart people. You all know what's best. But there's an assumption that says, I know what's best. Look at Absalom. He would say, look, if only I were appointed the judge of the land. I mean, if I was the one, if I was the king, if I was the one in charge, then everybody who had a complaint, they would have access to me. Everything would be good. I can do this better than David. The current king, he doesn't have a clue. In fact, he's kind of disconnected. He's a little bit old. Let's be honest. If he was really the king, he'd be out here instead of me. I can do this better. I decide what's best. Now, here's why this is so tricky, because you're like, okay, I'm smart. I think about things. I want to decide. I know what's best. And some of you are going, well, okay, but I know what's best for me. Here's the thing. Rebellion is often a response to a past hurt or difficulty. Absalom's father, David, was always too busy for him. And if you read the story, there was a set stretch for 5 years where David didn't even let Absalom see him or interact with him. When Tamar got raped by his oldest son, David did nothing. And so Absalom's accumulating these grievances. It hurts. And if you read the story, you realize how upset he was that his dad wouldn't pursue him for relationship. His entire rebellion was influenced by his personal history with his father. See, the problem is much of our rebellious spirit comes by our past. I'll give you an example. We're in a place and a leader does something that hurts or damages us, and you know what we say? I'm never trusting another leader again. I know lots of people like that. I know one person, he was heavily involved in his church. He got married, and he was a young guy, and him and his wife were just really involved. They did a lot of stuff. They got put into positions of leadership, and they got slapped down so hard, so damaged by their church. And they said, we're going to do it again. So when they went to the next church, they got involved. They were leading, and once again, they got squished. And this person told me at that point, they said, you know what? We're done. We're not done with church, but we will never be members of a church again. We've been damaged. We've been hurt. Don't want to do that. Don't want to go through that again. That hurt and that pain leads to this rebelliousness that says, I will not do that anymore. So your past hurts and issues is where you are most likely to have a rebellious spirit. So if you have a rebellious spirit, this is where it's going to happen. And again, let me give you a more silly example. So when we finished our basement in New Jersey, the land of, okay, let's just be nice. It's not the most friendly state. But I remember when we built our basement, we finished our basement, they said, well, you have to get permits. I said, oh, okay. So we did the permit. They said, well, now you need an inspection. You got to inspect your walls before you do anything else. The guy came in and said, well, you didn't use this, you did this. I could make you rip the whole thing out, but you can try this. I'm like, okay. Then I put in the insulation. You have to get inspected again. Okay, they came. Then you had to do the wiring. They came and inspected it, failed a bunch of things, had to fix it. Then they had to come and inspect it again. Then we had to put this other part on. Then they inspected that, the fire block, and then they come back and do the final inspection. It was so irritating and so time-consuming. Do you know what my heart said? Next time, I'm not telling anybody. And you were all nodding, going, yeah, that's the right way to go. That is a rebellious spirit coming out in my heart. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't really matter, but here's the thing. Our past experiences, those past hurts, is what drives often the rebellious spirit that we have inside. And that's why it's so difficult to spot, because it feels like we're just deciding what's best. And if you have a rebellious spirit and you're making a decision based on that, you will be able to justify it every single time. And it won't feel rebellious to you. Like, no, the government's stupid. They shouldn't have done that. That doesn't even make sense. It's illogical. I'm not doing that. And here's the worst part. You can always find people who go, yeah, you're totally right. Right? They'll agree with you. But look what Absalom did. He surrounded himself with people who would increasingly agree with him. And by the end, he was like, well, this is just a logical decision. This is the outflow of what it should be, because it's what everybody else agrees with. And so here's the thing. Rebellion always starts in your heart before it manifests in your actions. Absalom was a rebel long before he went to Hebron and announced that he was the king. But a rebellious spirit will never stay internal. So you're like, well, yeah, I have some of those in my life. You know, I can see some of those. They'll never stay there, ever. Because you'll always take things into your own hands. Absalom eventually moved forward on his king plan, and you notice he did it under the guise of worship. So he was actually using God in this. Absalom, these secret messengers. As soon as you hear the sound of the trump, say, Absalom's the king in Hebron. In other words, I am now making a move. There is a self-focus, a self-exaltation in a rebellious spirit. And if you're a quiet person, that doesn't mean you don't have one, because you can be just as rebellious by withdrawing and shutting down as you can by announcing yourself as king. Because it's what's going on here. It's not necessarily what's coming out outside. Withdrawing can be just as bad. And here's the problem. When we take things into our own hands, it's divisive, because a rebellious spirit is always, 100% of the time, divisive, even when it's cloaked in righteousness. Absalom was looking for and reaching out to troubled people. Did you notice that? He wanted to get them on his side. He didn't genuinely want to help them, because in reality, he had all these troubled people. When he was done with them, do you know what happened? They were troubled people who were now irritated. That was it. He didn't solve anything. Oh, man, I get your problem, and that's a horrible problem. I empathize with you completely. It's too bad somebody couldn't do anything. You know, have a good day. And now the person who's coming to see the king is like, yeah, I feel really lousy, but you know what? Someone should have done something. I can't believe the king's not doing it. He actually is more divisive, not less, but he has this guise of righteousness. Hey, I'm helping people. And what he was doing was sowing discontent. And if someone had said to Absalom, well, just, you're doing this, you're spreading divisiveness, you know what he would have said? And I've heard this in churches all the time. Tell me one thing I've done. I haven't done anything. I'm just talking to people. I'm just having conversations. I'm just saying what could have been. I'm just holding out a vision for a better future. Divisive people rarely see themselves as divisive. They see themselves as crusaders. And the rebellion is stirring up in their hearts. So Absalom stirs up dissatisfaction with David's government, campaigned against him by promising justice. And if you notice, Absalom goes from anger and disillusionment to murder, to insurrection, to sleeping with his father's concubines in the plain sight of everybody, and ultimately to war. Rebellion always leaks out into what we do. Now, the rest of the story, we don't have a ton of time, so we'll go quickly. The war didn't end well, and I would encourage you to read it. It's a fantastic account. It's one of the most bizarre events in all of Scripture, because here's how it goes. Now, Absalom, so they end up going to war. There's this whole string of things that are happening, and they end up, David's men go to war against the rest of Israel with Absalom's men, and it says, now Absalom happened to meet David's men. This is in the middle of the civil war. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree, and he was left hanging in midair while the mule just kept right on riding. I mean, the picture here is fantastic, right? And remember, this is important because what was the thing that they mentioned that talked about how amazing he was his hair. Now, he probably should have got it cut the day before he went to battle, right? Okay? And now this is funny. So they're having this, and one of the men sees this, doesn't know what to do with it, runs to Joab, who's the general, says, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Now, you got to read this because Joab, the general of David's forces, says, did you kill him? Guy's like, no, I'm not killing him. That's the king's son. He doesn't want him to die. Joab says, oh, I got to do this myself. And while he's hanging in the tree, drives 3 spears right through his heart and kills Absalom. And the rebellion is ended. And David gets restored to the throne. And what I find fascinating in this account is how David responded to this rebellion. Do you remember when David was running from Saul? He could have started a rebellion. He had lots of support. He could have and almost certainly would have won the kingship. But he didn't. He left it in God's hands. And now, 35 years later, he's in the position of king. Absalom wants to be king and starts a rebellion that David probably could have squashed. He could have had Absalom killed. He could have called those loyal to him to fight for his honor. Instead, he left it in God's hands. Now understand, that doesn't mean he was passive. He wasn't passive. Read the story. He didn't sit and do nothing. He did all kinds of things in there, but he simply did not retain the right to make the final decision. And I find it interesting because you see when David runs, of course, the religious people followed him. And you can read it, the priests and the prophets, they follow David. They bring the Ark of the Covenant with him. And here's what David says. I find this just an insight into his heart. The king said to Zadok, who's the guy who's bringing the whole Ark, God's presence with them, he says, take the Ark of God back to the city. The people need this. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. You cannot fake that. That's someone saying, you know what? And by the way, this isn't a fatalistic kind of Eeyore statement. David wasn't like, well, whatever God wants to do. That's not it. He's not being passive. He was active. He was saving his family. He was leading people. He was setting spies up in Absalom's inner circle. He was arranging for the spiritual welfare of the kingdom. But he was willing to give God a free hand in the results of what to do. So here's the thing. If you want to kill a rebellious spirit, it's dealt with, and get this, by submitting to God's right to make decisions for me. That is hard. It's like David said, look, I didn't lift a finger to be made king. I will not lift a finger to preserve being king. It's not my responsibility to take or keep authority, because it just might be God's will that I'm not king anymore. I don't know. Because after all, it's his kingdom. And here's the truth, if you're a follower of Jesus, it ain't your life. It's his. It's not mine, it's his. And so instead of trying to hold on to the kingdom, David is letting it go. And I wonder sometimes if we are more interested in seeking God himself than we do the things that he gives us in his power and his blessing. And could you say the same thing as David said right there, if God started to take away your job, your home, your family, your health? I find it interesting that David still worshiped even when he wasn't sure God was on his side. If God has entrusted you with position or power or money or stuff or authority, are you willing to lose it? To give it up? If you're in a situation that's not to your liking, Are you willing to trust God in it? There's a great temptation to take things into our own hands, and as we get older and wiser, we think we can do it. See, Absalom really provides the other end of the parentheses in the story of David. So when we look at this tale of three kings, it's three kings, and the two kings, Saul and Absalom, are like the brackets around David's life. Because when David had nothing but a promise, running from King Saul, he refused to take things into his own hands, to rebel, or to have the right of final decision, and he let God. And when David had it all, the kingdom, the people, but faced the rebellion of his own son, he refused to take things into his own hands and have the right of final decision, and he let God. He left the ultimate results, and he focused his things on his heart. We've said in this whole thing, God wants to transform our inner being. That's the whole point of this series. And what a rebellious spirit does is it stops that in its tracks because it says, I get to decide, God, where you get to work. And right now, what you're doing is really uncomfortable. I don't like the people you've got me with or the situation you've got me in. So you know what? I'm going to take control for a little bit because I don't want to do that. I don't want to be here anymore. So if you wonder if you have a rebellious spirit, because like we said at the beginning, none of you do, but you might know people that do, there are three things you can do. Three things. Two are fairly straightforward. One requires a lot of bravery, but they all require honesty. So I'm going to give them to you. And I would encourage you to consider these. Here's the things you could do. I want you to think of moments where you are justifying your actions to yourself or to others, or where you have a list of reasons for doing what you're doing. And you know exactly what I'm talking about because you have imaginary conversations in your head. I know why I'm doing this, because of A, B, C, and you're making these lists, and nobody's asking you. But you're justifying yourself. Pay attention. That's usually where a rebellious spirit begins. Number one. Number two, list those areas in your life that you have either consciously or unconsciously made off limits to God. Those places, you may have never said it out loud. You said, God, you can have my life, you can have it all, but please leave this alone. Just make sure this is okay. Yeah, God, I'm surrendering to you, but I don't want to have this. What are those? Might be a sign of a rebellious spirit. And then, here's the one that's brave. Ask someone close to you whether you might have a rebellious spirit. You want to be brave? Talk to your spouse. Talk to your best friend and say, where do I show this? And then let them tell you. We're going to do communion this morning. I actually think it's a lovely end to this entire series. So I'm going to ask the team to come up, and we're going to do a song. Here's what I'm going to have you do. I'm going to have you sit during this song. The elders are going to come up, and as they sing this, it's, "Oh, come all you unfaithful." It's an invitation, knowing and recognizing our brokenness to come to God. I want you to stay seated. You can sing along. You can pray. You can bow your heads. You can watch the words. However you can connect with God. But as the song goes on, they're going to pass out the elements of communion. And I want you to just be thinking about this, asking God to give you some revelation of himself. And we're going to do that song, hold on to the elements, and then after the song, we're going to take communion together. Okay? So team, why don't you lead us?
Oh
if you read to the end of Absalom's story, and read the reaction of David, the whole story ends up with the battle, and then, of course, these two messengers come. They kind of have this foot race to come give the message that the rebellion is over, that Absalom is dead. Here's how David responded. The king was shaken, and he went up to the room over the gateway, and he wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, a son that cost many lives. People died. David had to run. A son that dishonored him, that split the nation." And David mourned. What a foreshadowing of our Savior. But God demonstrated his love for us in this, that we were still in rebellion to him. He died for us. While we were in rebellion, when we wrecked everything, when we put ourselves first, he said, "I will die to take your place." And now he invites us out of our rebellion into full and complete surrender. Everything. And trust him with it. No rebellion in the kingdom of God is proper, and it will never be blessed. So as we eat and we drink together, can you commit to the honest and difficult work of submitting to him because of his sacrifice for you? Let's eat and drink together. Why don't you stand with me before we sing the last song? I want to read a prayer that I read this week that I love. Almost like a liturgy. Let me read it for us with our heads bowed, and then we will sing together to close the service. Father, the light of your glory has shone with splendor in our world. For you gave Jesus Christ, your only Son, to be born for us through Mary, that we might have the power to become your children through him. Jesus, who existed before the world was called into being, but came down to save us by being born of a humble virgin, lying in a manger, walking on earth as a man, who became poor, that by his poverty we might become rich, who was humbled, that we might be exalted, who died for our rebellion so that we might find peace in submission, who gave us peace and joy when we were without hope and without God. Therefore, with the whole company of saints in heaven and on earth, we proclaim and celebrate the birth, life, death, and resurrection of our Savior. Amen.